President Obama's time in office highlighted for a lot of Americans and maybe really sort of everyone in the world that race was still a really big component of Americans' political attitudes, their views of candidates, their views of policies. And so when Barack Obama took positions on issues, on policies like healthcare reform, it often led Americans to polarize their views about that issue based on their racial attitudes. A few days before the 2012 presidential election, this massive hurricane and then superstorm made landfall on the east coast of the United States. It did significant amounts of damage to property. It affected a lot of lives. It hit very densely populated areas. And after the disaster, the kind of public reaction, the public response is one that viewed President Obama and the federal government's response as pretty much universally positive, that the response was handled really effectively. There were lots of sort of signs of bipartisanship that came out of that response. And we were curious about whether or not, despite this sort of positive public view, the views about President Obama's response to the disaster would also become racialized. Part of what this research builds on is this area of work on racial spillover. So this kind of collection of scholarship which looks at how people's views about Barack Obama, how their racial attitudes are wrapped up in their views of Barack Obama, would spill over into related areas. Essentially that by virtue of becoming associated with a policy debate or with another event or issue, people would come to view that issue through the lens of race because of President Obama's association to that. We exposed half of our sample to a cue that made them think about Barack Obama and another half to a cue that made them think about the federal government. And we found that people who had thought about Barack Obama were much more likely to polarize along their racial attitudes when they evaluated the government's response to the disaster. But we also found that those effects, that polarization was largely concentrated among people who had been affected by the disaster. When people are affected by these big momentous events, they struggle and they are motivated to kind of understand why this happened and to attribute blame for kind of responses to those events. How do you turn this off, right? How do you kind of get people to limit this polarization? I think one of the answers is that it might not be possible in the short term, or at the very least, due to kind of the natural way in which we process information and stereotype things, that you can't just sort of say, don't do this. As African Americans get elected more often, as American voters start to update and reevaluate what they expect or think a politician is, most of the work says that they think of a politician as a white male. So as they think about that less, as they think more broadly about that, I would say that's a good chance that you kind of get those stereotypes to be less prominent, less present, and that might deactivate the spillover.